If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The Texas sun hung like molten brass in the sky, melting into the cracked asphalt of an endless road. The roar of motorcycles cut through the silence of the lonely stretch of highway. A pack of leather-clad riders surging forward like ironclad ghosts of the past. They rode in tight formation, a force of rebels, outlaws, and men who had been forgotten by society, moving as one under the unrelenting heat. At the front of the pack was Connor Raven Hayes, a man carved from mistakes, regrets, and unspoken debts. His jaw was rigid with experience, his knuckles white on the handlebars of his Harley, a beast that had been his only constant companion through years of bad decisions. To the world, he was nothing more than an ex-con biker with a past too heavy to shake, but there had been a time when he had stood for something. That time was long gone. Until today, a sharp, desperate sound broke through the rumbling of engines. A sound that didn't belong on this forsaken road. A whimper. Connor's eyes flicked to the side, and what he saw sent a shockwave through his chest. There, lying in the middle of the cracked road, was a dog. A German shepherd, his tan and black fur streaked with blood, his massive body still but for the slight rise and fall of labored breaths. He wore a tactical vest, battered but unmistakable in its bold white lettering. Canine unit. Connor didn't hesitate. Stop! His voice was like a gunshot as he threw his fist in the air, commanding the pack to an immediate halt. The line of motorcycles skidded, tires screeching against asphalt, leaving behind the ghostly echoes of their roar. The silence that followed was unnatural. Rick, his second in command, pulled up beside him, his brows furrowed in frustration. What the hell, Raven? Why are we stopping? But Connor was already swinging off his bike, his boots crunching against the road as he approached the dog. Jesus, he breathed. Up close, the damage was worse. The dog's flank was torn open, deep scratches lining his ribcage. Blood darkened the pavement beneath him, pooling slowly. His chest heaved in short, pained breaths. But what struck Connor the most wasn't the injury. It was the dog's eyes, locked onto him with desperation. Not fear, not resignation, determination. Even now, bleeding out under the cruel sun, this dog was trying to complete a mission. Connor crouched beside him, running a calloused hand over the thick canine collar around the dog's neck. And then he saw it. A small blinking camera attached to the vest, recording. A chill ran down Connor's spine. Without thinking, he pressed the playback button. The screen flickered to life. The footage was chaotic. A black sedan swerving across the road, the sound of gunfire ripping through the air. The dog was running, his powerful legs pumping as he sprinted alongside a police car, his handler's voice ringing out, "Duke, go." And then, the feed jerked violently. The world spun in the camera's lens. A scream, a crash, static. Connor's stomach tightened. Something had gone horribly wrong. His fingers clenched into fists. This wasn't an accident. This was an ambush. And now, Duke was the only one left. "Where's your partner, boy?" Connor muttered under his breath. Duke whimpered, his massive frame trembling with the effort to move. His gaze locked onto Connor's, pleading. In the distance, the sound of sirens ripped through the silence. "Raven, cops are coming." Rick's voice cut through his thoughts. "We need to get the hell out of here before they pin this on us." The others were shifting nervously, their eyes flicking between Connor and the rising dust clouds of oncoming police cars. They were already outlaws in the eyes of the law. If they were caught here, next to a bleeding canine cop, there would be no questions asked. They'd be guilty by association. But Connor didn't move. For the first time in years, he gave a damn. Rick cursed, stepping closer. "Connor, we can't get involved with this. Let the dog be. He's done for anyway." But Connor barely heard him. His eyes were locked onto Duke, and in that moment, he made a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. He reached down, scooped Duke into his arms, and turned to Rick with fire in his eyes. "Get the van." Rick stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're gonna get us all arrested. Now." Connor's voice left no room for argument. Rick hesitated for half a second, then muttered a curse and peeled off toward the side road where their old black van was parked. Connor turned back toward the police cars, their flashing lights blinding as they skidded to a stop just yards away. The doors flew open, and officers poured out, their guns raised. "Freeze, put the dog down and step away." For a split second, Connor considered surrendering. But then, his grip on Duke tightened. If this was an ambush, if Duke's handler had already been eliminated, then whoever was behind this was still out there, and Duke was the only witness. Connor took one last look at the officers, at their guns, their suspicion, their uniforms that had once meant something to him. Then he turned and ran. Shouts erupted behind him. Bullets ricocheted off the pavement as the van skidded onto the street. "Raven, move!" Rick bellowed. With everything in him, Connor sprinted. His boots slammed against the pavement, his heart hammering, the weight of Duke's body solid in his arms. Then, he launched himself into the back of the van. The doors slammed shut. Rick floored it. Tires screeched. The van tore down the road, leaving behind a trail of dust, sirens, and bullets. Inside the van, Connor cradled Duke against his chest, his breaths coming fast and ragged. His fingers trembled as he brushed blood-matted fur from the dog's face. Duke's eyes fluttered open, tired, in pain, but still locked onto him with that same unyielding trust. Connor swallowed hard. He had just made himself a fugitive, for a dog. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back now. Because whatever had happened to Duke's handler, whatever corruption was at play, the truth was worth the fight, even if it meant risking everything. The van tore down the highway, its battered frame shaking under the pressure of a full-throttle escape. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the stench of motor oil, blood, and fear mingling in the confined space. Connor pressed his back against the cold metal wall, cradling Duke in his arms. The dog's body was dead weight, his chest rising in uneven, shallow breaths. "Hang in there, buddy," Connor muttered, running a hand over the blood-matted fur. Duke whimpered, but didn't look away. Even now, weak and bleeding out, his canine training wouldn't let him give up. He was still trying to complete his mission. Rick, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white, shot a glare at Connor through the rearview mirror. "I hope to hell you know what you're doing." His voice was sharp with anger, fear, and disbelief. "We just stole a damn police dog, Raven. That ain't exactly a traffic violation." Connor exhaled hard, his mind racing. "We didn't steal him. We saved him," he corrected. His voice was firm, but his stomach was coiled in knots. He knew the second those officers caught up, they wouldn't care about the details. All they'd see was a biker gang making off with an injured K9, and that meant every cop in Texas would be hunting them down. Rick slammed his fist on the wheel. "The whole damn state is going to be on our asses." "We should have left him." Connor whirled around, fire flashing in his eyes. "Left him?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You saw that footage. Someone set them up. That means whoever took out his handler isn't done yet." Rick scoffed. "And what? You think we're going to solve this case like some backroad detectives?" Connor's jaw clenched. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear, this wasn't over. "We get Duke patched up," he said, his voice tight. "Then we figure out who the hell wanted him dead." Rick let out a frustrated breath but didn't argue. Instead, he veered sharply onto an abandoned dirt road, tires kicking up dust as he maneuvered toward their hideout, an old, rusted auto shop buried in the woods just outside town. As they sped away, the distant howl of sirens faded into the night. But Connor knew better. This was just the beginning. The van screeched to a halt in front of the old rundown garage, their unofficial clubhouse, a place where broken men could disappear. The gang scrambled out, still rattled by the night's chaos. Connor jumped down, carrying Duke's limp form as carefully as he could. "Somebody get the damn med kit," he barked. The gang hesitated. Some of them were still staring at the dog, as if questioning why the hell their leader was risking everything for a damn K9. Rick tossed the kit at Connor's feet, still fuming. "You want to play nurse? Be my guest. But the longer we sit here, the closer those cops get." Connor ignored him. He knelt beside Duke, opening the kit with shaking hands. Duke let out a low whimper as Connor pressed a cloth to his wounds. The gash along his ribs was bad, but the bleeding was slowing. He needed stitches. He needed a vet, but taking him to one? Not an option. "You're a tough son of a bitch," Connor muttered, running a gentle hand down the dog's side. Duke's eyes fluttered open, just for a second. That look. Connor's throat tightened. That was the same look he had seen 100 times before. In the eyes of fallen brothers. The men who had bled out beside him in fights they didn't deserve. No, not this time. Connor worked fast, cleaning the wound and wrapping it with what little supplies they had. "You think he's worth all this?" Rick muttered, arms crossed. Connor barely looked up. "That dog took a bullet for someone. How many people can say they'd do the same?" Rick didn't answer. But the truth hung heavy between them. The garage was eerily silent. The gang sat in tight, uncomfortable tension, watching as Connor hunched over the small blinking camera he had pulled from Duke's vest. With a deep breath, he plugged it into an old, battered laptop. The screen flickered to life. The gang leaned in. The footage began just as before, Duke running alongside a police cruiser, his handler shouting commands. Then came the black sedan, the gunfire, the chaos. But this time, Connor paused the video. Something he hadn't noticed before. There. His voice was sharp as he pointed at the blurry figure behind the wheel of the sedan. He zoomed in. The screen sharpened just enough to see the driver's face. Rick stiffened. No way. Connor's blood ran cold. Because the man behind the wheel wasn't just some thug. He was a cop. A damn cop. The silence was deafening. "Tell me I'm seeing things," Rick muttered, but they all knew the truth. Duke hadn't just been running from criminals. He had been running from the very people who were supposed to protect him. Connor's stomach turned. "That's why they want him dead," he muttered. "He's the only one who saw what happened." Rick swore under his breath. "If that's the case, we're sitting on a damn ticking bomb." Connor leaned back, exhaling. This wasn't just some botched operation. This was corruption. And now? They were in the middle of it. The air inside the garage was thick with tension, the kind that sat heavy on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Connor leaned back, running a hand over his face. The footage they had just seen played on a loop in his mind. A cop. The man driving the black sedan that had ambushed Duke's handler was a cop. It wasn't just some random hit. It was an execution. And now the only living witness to that crime was bleeding out on the floor next to him. Rick let out a long breath, shaking his head. "This is bad," he muttered. "Like, we're gonna die in a ditch bad." Connor didn't answer. He was thinking, piecing it all together. Whoever had attacked Duke and his handler wasn't just trying to take out one officer. They were trying to bury something bigger. And if a dirty cop was involved, then this went way higher than just some low-level criminals. The realization made his stomach turn. They weren't just on the run from the police anymore. They were running from the people who controlled them. Outside, the night was silent. Too silent. Connor had spent enough time in the shadows to know that meant one thing. Someone was watching them. He motioned to Rick, his voice barely above a whisper. "Check the perimeter." Rick gave him a look but nodded, grabbing a crowbar before slipping into the darkness. The rest of the gang sat uneasy, shifting in their seats. They weren't built for this. Biker gangs didn't go to war with the police, and they sure as hell didn't play the role of heroes. But Connor had already made up his mind. They weren't leaving Duke behind. Rick returned 5 minutes later, his face grim. "We've got company," he muttered. Connor's body tensed. "How many?" "2 cars," Rick said. "They're parked down the road, lights off. Could be waiting, could be watching." Connor glanced toward Duke. The dog's ears were alert, his body tense. He could sense it too. "They're not waiting for backup," Connor murmured. Rick frowned. "What do you mean?" Connor's jaw clenched. "If they were here to arrest us, they'd already done it." Rick's face paled as the words sank in. "Then what the hell are they waiting for?" Connor's eyes darkened. A clean shot. The first gunshot shattered the silence. The garage erupted into chaos as the bullet ripped through a window, sending glass flying. "Get down," Connor shouted, diving behind a stack of tires as more gunfire tore through the walls. The gang scrambled for cover, cursing as bullets sprayed the room. These weren't warning shots. They weren't being arrested. They were being silenced. Connor reached for his gun, his pulse hammering. He peeked out, catching a glimpse of shadows moving outside. They were coming in. He turned to Rick. "We need to move now," Rick nodded. "Back exit?" Connor shook his head. "Too obvious, they'll be waiting." He turned to Duke, who was still too weak to run. His gut twisted. If they wanted to get out alive, they'd have to fight, and that meant taking the fight to them. Connor grabbed a Molotov cocktail from a shelf, an old insurance policy the gang kept for emergencies. "This is the dumbest thing we've ever done," Rick muttered. Connor smirked. "Then let's make it count." He lit the rag, waited for the right moment, then hurled it through the open doorway. The explosion lit up the night, the flames illuminating the attackers outside. "Now!" Connor roared, leading the charge. The gang poured out, weapons swinging, fists flying. The gunmen were caught off guard, stumbling back as the garage turned into a battlefield. Connor tackled one of the men, slamming him into the ground before grabbing his gun. Rick took down another with a brutal swing of his crowbar. In the chaos, Duke found his strength. The dog launched forward, his instincts kicking in, as he sank his teeth into one of the attacker's arms. The man screamed, trying to shake him off, but Duke didn't let go. He was a canine warrior, and he wasn't done fighting. By the time the dust settled, the gunmen were either down or running. The gang stood panting, bruised but alive. Connor wiped blood from his lip, stepping over one of the fallen attackers. He grabbed the man by the collar, yanking him up. "Who sent you?" he growled. The man spat blood, chuckling darkly. "You're already dead, Raven," he sneered. "You just don't know it yet." Connor's fingers tightened around the man's collar. "You tell whoever sent you," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "We're not running." The man grinned, his teeth red with blood. "They're not coming for you," he whispered. "They're coming for the dog." Connor's blood turned to ice. The man laughed, his voice rasping. "They don't need to kill you," he croaked. "They just need to take him back." Connor felt his stomach drop. Duke, the only living witness to their crime. The only thing keeping them from getting away with murder. And now Connor had a choice. Let Duke go and save himself, or fight to the death for a dog that had already given everything. His mind was made up before the thought even finished. Connor let go of the man. Then, without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. A single gunshot rang through the night. Then, silence. Rick exhaled sharply. "We just made things worse, didn't we?" Connor looked down at Duke. The dog had saved a life. Now, Connor would do the same. "For once," he muttered, "we did the right thing." But deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. The night was thick with the scent of burning rubber and blood. The gang stood panting, barely able to process what had just happened. Bodies lay scattered across the lot, some groaning, others motionless. The flames from Connor's Molotov still flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the garage. Duke, his breathing still ragged, lay beside Connor, his eyes flickering between exhaustion and defiance. The dog had fought harder than anyone that night. And now he was the most valuable target in the city. Connor wiped the sweat from his forehead, his hands still trembling from the gunfight. He turned to Rick, his voice low, almost too calm. "We need to move, now." Rick, his knuckles white from gripping his crowbar, scoffed. "No kidding, genius. We just shot at cops. Or worse. They're gonna come down on us like a damn hurricane." Connor didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Duke. Because no matter what happened, the dog wasn't safe. And that meant none of them were. The gang's hideout was compromised. They all knew it. Connor loaded Duke into the back of the van, his movements careful but firm. The dog whimpered softly, but Connor didn't let the guilt settle. "You're not dying today, boy," he whispered, brushing a hand over Duke's fur. Rick revved the engine, spinning the tires as the van shot down the empty road, kicking up dust in its wake. "Where the hell are we even going?" One of the gang members muttered from the back seat. Connor's jaw clenched. "We need somewhere safe, somewhere they won't expect." Rick exhaled sharply. "So what? We just keep driving till we fall off the map?" Connor shook his head. "No, we're going to someone who owes me a favor." Rick's fingers tightened on the wheel. "Connor, tell me you're not talking about him." But Connor didn't answer, because deep down, he knew this was a bad idea. But it was the only one they had. They arrived at a warehouse on the edge of town. No signs, no windows, just steel doors and concrete walls. Rick let out a low curse. "Are we really doing this?" Connor didn't hesitate. He climbed out, slamming the van door shut behind him. "If we want to survive, we don't have a choice." He approached the door and knocked twice, then once more. Silence. Then the sound of locks turning. The steel door creaked open, revealing a man in his 40s, tall, lean, with calculating eyes. "You've got some nerve coming here, Hayes." Connor forced a smirk. "Nice to see you too, Logan." The man, Logan Shaw, leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "You dragged me into your mess before, Connor. I swore I'd never do it again." Connor tilted his head. "And yet, here we are." Logan's gaze shifted behind Connor, catching sight of Duke in the van. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "The dog," Logan muttered, his voice dropped to something quieter. "You realize what you're carrying, right?" Connor nodded. "That's why I need your help." For a long moment, Logan didn't move. Then with a sigh, he stepped aside. "Get inside, all of you, and don't make me regret this." The warehouse was filled with old equipment, dusty crates, and the smell of engine oil. Logan led them to the back, where a small cot had been set up. Connor carefully placed Duke down, the dog letting out a soft groan. "He needs a vet," Logan said, his tone sharp. Connor shook his head. "We can't risk it. They'll be watching every clinic, every hospital." Logan rubbed his temple. "Then what the hell do you expect me to do? Wave a magic wand?" Connor didn't answer. His mind was racing. They had a lead, the license plate, the footage. They just needed time. And time was the one thing they didn't have. Across the room, Rick was pacing, his hands twitching. "I don't like this, Connor," he muttered. "We're putting a hell of a lot of trust in a guy who—" Then something caught Connor's attention. A red light, blinking, right next to Logan's old phone. Connor's stomach dropped. The call had already been made, and they were already too late. The moment Connor's fist collided with Logan's jaw, the man stumbled back, blood spraying from his lip. "You called them," Connor snarled, his voice deadly. Logan wiped his mouth, his expression unreadable. "Had to," he muttered. "They gave me a choice. Either I give you up, or they take me out too." Rick let out a string of curses. "We should have never trusted him." Connor felt his pulse pounding. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder. They weren't just coming, they were already here. Logan stared at Connor, something almost apologetic in his eyes. "Run," he muttered, "while you still can." But Connor wasn't listening. His focus was on Duke, on getting the dog out, because if the cops took Duke, they wouldn't put him in a kennel, they'd put him in the ground. Connor grabbed Duke, ignoring the sharp pain in his arms as he lifted the injured dog. Rick was already at the back exit, fumbling with the lock. "Connor, move your ass." But the front door exploded inward, the force knocking Logan off his feet. A swarm of armed men poured inside, guns raised. "Drop the dog," one of them shouted. Connor's grip tightened. His heart pounded. They weren't going to make it. Unless— Connor's gaze flicked to Logan. The man, still sprawled on the ground, gave him a single nod. Then, without a second thought, Logan reached into his jacket and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot shattered the air. Chaos erupted. Bullets ripped through the warehouse. Rick kicked open the back door, grabbing Connor's sleeve. "Go." And then they were running. Running into the night. Running for their lives. With Duke's life hanging in the balance. The night swallowed them whole as Connor, Rick, and Duke disappeared into the darkness. The roar of gunfire still echoed in Connor's ears, but there was no time to think, only to run. His breath came in sharp bursts, his arms tightening around Duke's limp body. The dog whimpered softly, his fur damp with sweat and blood. They didn't have long. "Trucks this way," Rick panted, cutting through an abandoned alley behind the warehouse. The sirens were closing in, red and blue lights flickering in the distance, like the open jaws of a beast ready to swallow them whole. Connor's pulse pounded as he sprinted forward, his grip firm on Duke. The canine's body was lighter than before, a sickening sign that his strength was fading. They reached the truck, just as a pair of headlights flared to life behind them. "Go! Go!" Connor roared as Rick threw open the driver's side door. Bullets ricocheted off the pavement, sparks flying. Rick slammed his foot on the gas, tires screeching as the truck fishtailed wildly before shooting down the road. The force slammed Connor against the door, his hands locking around Duke tighter. "Where the hell do we go now?" Rick shouted, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Connor didn't answer. His eyes flicked down to Duke, whose chest barely rose and fell. He was dying. The betrayal, the ambush, the gunfire, none of it mattered. If Duke didn't make it, then none of this had been worth it. "Find me a vet," Connor said, his voice dangerously calm. Rick shot him a look. "Are you out of your damn mind? Every clinic in the state is probably already on alert. The second we walk in, we're done." "Then find me someone who doesn't ask questions," Connor growled. Rick muttered a curse under his breath and yanked the wheel hard, sending the truck veering down a side road. "I know a guy," he admitted reluctantly. "But if we go there, we're stepping into another level of trouble." Connor looked down at Duke, his fingers brushing over the dog's ears, then stepped faster. Rick's guy turned out to be an ex-army medic named Grayson Wolfe, a man with a past as bloody as his reputation. He operated in the shadows, patching up people who couldn't walk into a hospital without flashing red flags. The moment they pulled up to a rundown garage on the outskirts of town, Connor knew they weren't welcome. A barrel-chested man with tattooed arms stepped out from the shadows, a cigarette dangling between his lips. His sharp eyes narrowed as they locked onto the truck. "Y'all look like roadkill," Grayson muttered. Connor didn't hesitate. He threw open the door and lifted Duke out of the truck, the dog barely reacting. "We need help now," Connor said, his voice laced with undeniable authority. Grayson took one look at the canine and let out a low whistle. "You do realize this mutt's worth more than your lives right now? Every cop in the country is looking for him." "That's why we need you," Rick interjected. "Can you help or not?" Grayson flicked his cigarette into the dirt. "Bring him in." The makeshift clinic was nothing more than an abandoned auto shop, the stench of old oil mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Medical supplies were scattered across tool benches, and a single rusted table sat in the center of the room. Connor carefully laid Duke down, his throat tightening as the dog let out a weak whimper. Grayson pulled on a pair of gloves. "Tell me what happened." "Bullet wound to the side," Connor said quickly. "Lost blood, been running on fumes, took a hit earlier but kept fighting." Grayson shook his head. "Jesus, damn canines, man. They don't know when to quit." Connor swallowed hard. "That's why we need to make sure he gets the chance." Grayson nodded and got to work. For the next 40 minutes, the only sounds in the room were shallow breathing, the beeping of Grayson's ancient medical equipment, and the occasional hiss of pain from Duke as wounds were stitched and bandaged. Connor didn't move. He just watched. Waited. Prayed. Rick paced in the corner, arms crossed tightly. "I don't like this, man. The second someone sees that dog breathing, we're done. You know that, right?" Connor barely heard him. His world had shrunk to the rise and fall of Duke's chest. Then, finally, Grayson let out a slow breath and peeled off his gloves. "He's stable," the medic muttered. "Barely, but stable." Connor exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He didn't realize how tight his body had been wounded until that moment. "He'll need time," Grayson continued, lighting another cigarette. "And I don't think time's something you boys have." Connor finally looked at him. "You know something we don't?" Grayson's eyes darkened. "I know that if you've got the kind of people willing to gun down cops and hunt a canine, you're dealing with something bigger than just corruption." Rick scoffed. "Yeah, no shit. We figured that part out after we got shot at." Grayson ignored him and turned back to Connor. "Whatever's on that dog's camera, it's bigger than just dirty cops. If you want to live long enough to use it, you better start thinking 2 steps ahead." Connor's jaw clenched, because Grayson was right, and he already knew their next move. With Duke finally stable, Connor stepped outside. The cool air did little to calm the storm raging in his chest. Rick followed, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right, boss, what's the plan now?" Connor pulled out his phone. "We find the handler." Rick frowned. "You think he's still alive?" Connor's grip on the phone tightened. "He has to be." Rick let out a breath. "And if he's not?" Connor's eyes burned with something lethal. "Then we find who pulled the trigger, and we burn them to the ground." Rick nodded slowly. "And Duke?" Connor glanced back at the dog, still resting on the table inside. "That dog fought to stay alive for a reason." His voice was low, cold, deadly. "I'm not going to let that be for nothing." The air outside was thick with silence, the kind that settles just before a storm. Connor stood by the truck, eyes locked on the dark horizon, every fiber of his being coiled like a spring. Duke was alive, for now, but the real fight was just beginning. Behind him, Rick lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke into the cold night. "So we're just supposed to march in there and find a guy who's probably already dead?" he muttered. Connor didn't take his eyes off the road. "He's alive." Rick scoffed. "And you know this how? Gut feeling?" Connor turned, his expression hard as stone. "Because if he was dead, Duke wouldn't still be fighting." Rick hesitated. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell Connor that they were in way over their heads, but deep down, he knew Connor was never wrong about these things. "Fine," Rick muttered, tossing the cigarette into the dirt. But if this all goes sideways, I'm blaming you. Connor gave a half smirk. Wouldn't have it any other way. Their only lead was a name. Officer Daniel Price, Duke's handler. The last person seen with the dog before everything went to hell. And he had vanished. Officially, Price had been declared missing in action after the ambush. No body, no reports, just another name added to a pile of unsolved cases. But Connor wasn't buying it. Someone had erased him. And people didn't just vanish, not without help. Rick pulled the truck into an empty lot near an old storage facility, shutting off the engine. "All right, genius," he said. "Where the hell do we even start?" Connor leaned forward, resting his arms on the dashboard. "We find his last known location." Rick let out a dry laugh. "And how do you suggest we do that? Call up the precinct? Hey, it's us, the criminals with the stolen K9 dog. Mind telling us where your missing officer went?" Connor reached into his pocket, pulling out Duke's camera. The small device had been through hell, but it was still intact. "We use what we have," Rick blinked. "Wait, you're telling me that thing still got footage?" Connor nodded. "The last place Duke saw his handler. It's on here." Rick let out a low whistle. "All right, Sherlock, let's see what the dog saw." They connected the camera to a burner laptop, the screen flickering as the footage loaded. The first few seconds were nothing but static. Then the image cleared. Duke was running. The view bobbed wildly as the K9 sprinted through an alley, his handler's voice sharp in the background. "Gunfire ahead! Move, move!" Then, chaos, flashes of light, a black SUV swerving into view, the deafening crack of bullets splitting the air. Price's voice, desperate, commanding. "Duke, get down!" The handler's body twisted as he fired back, taking cover behind a dumpster. Duke stayed low, alert, ready. Then, something was wrong. Another SUV roared into view, cutting off their escape. Price turned, trying to drag Duke back, but it was too late. A figure stepped out of the second SUV. Connor leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Pause it." Rick hit the spacebar, freezing the frame. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. A man in military-grade tactical gear, face hidden behind a mask. But it wasn't just some random mercenary. The insignia on his chest, not police, not FBI, private security. Rick whistled. "That's not some street gang. That's government money." Connor's jaw clenched. "And look at this." He pointed to the timestamp on the footage. This wasn't days ago. It was yesterday. Price wasn't just missing. He was still alive. Tracking the SUVs was impossible. But Connor knew one thing about dirty operations. They always left a trail. And when powerful people wanted something erased, they didn't kill it. They sold it. "They're trafficking him," Connor muttered. And Duke was never the main target. Rick frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Connor turned the laptop toward him, tapping the screen. They were after Price. Duke was just a bonus. Rick cursed under his breath. "You're saying they're gonna sell a cop?" Connor's expression was deadly. "And if we don't move fast, he won't live long enough to be bought." Rick wasn't thrilled. At all. "We barely made it out of the last fight alive," he snapped. "And now you want to walk into an illegal human auction like we're shopping for groceries?" Connor tightened his grip on the truck's door. "We don't have a choice," Rick exhaled, shaking his head. "I hate you sometimes, you know that?" Connor smirked. "Yeah, but you love the chaos." Rick sighed. "Damn it. Fine. What's the plan?" Connor looked down at Duke, who had lifted his head slightly, watching them with tired but determined eyes. "We do what we do best," Connor said. "Crash the party." It was a warehouse, hidden beneath a front company, a shipping logistics firm. But inside, a high-end human trafficking ring where dirty cops, politicians, and cartel members gathered in secret to buy and sell lives. And tonight, Price was on the list. Connor and Rick pulled up near the back entrance, their weapons locked and loaded. Inside the truck, Duke whined softly. He was still injured, still weak, but his ears were sharp, alert. He knew. His handler was in there. Connor ran a hand down the dog's fur. "I know, buddy. We'll get him." Rick adjusted his vest. "Last chance to back out." Connor smirked. "You know damn well I'm not." Rick sighed. "I really gotta stop hanging out with you." Connor cracked his neck, gripping the steel crowbar he had grabbed from the garage earlier. Then, without hesitation, he kicked in the door. The moment they stepped inside, hell erupted. The guards barely had time to react before Connor and Rick tore through them, dropping men with brutal efficiency. Connor swung the crowbar, cracking a guard's skull before grabbing his pistol. Rick fired 2 clean shots, sending another collapsing to the floor. But they weren't here for a fight. They were here for Price. And they found him chained to a chair in the center of the auction hall. His face was bloodied, his badge ripped from his vest, but his eyes burned with defiance. Connor stepped forward, gripping the chains. "You still with us?" Price coughed, his voice weak but steady. "Took you long enough." Behind them, Duke barked, loud, sharp, full of life, and for the first time since this all began, Price smiled. Then, gunfire. The real fight had just begun. The gunfire exploded through the auction hall like a thunderstorm tearing through the sky. Bullets ripped through the air, shattering glass and punching into crates of illicit goods. The once orderly room had collapsed into pure chaos, bidders and criminals alike scrambling for cover. But Connor? Connor wasn't running. Neither was Duke. Rick fired from behind an overturned table, his pistol kicking back with each shot. "We're surrounded," he shouted, ducking as bullets whizzed overhead. Connor didn't answer. He was already moving. A guard charged him from the left. Connor dodged, twisting low, and slammed his crowbar into the man's knee. The guard screamed as he collapsed, and Connor finished the job with a swift strike to the temple. Rick cursed. "You ever think about carrying a gun like a normal person?" Connor smirked, ripping the guy's rifle from his hands. "I adapt." Then he turned and opened fire. In the chaos, Duke struggled to his feet. His body was weak, pain still radiating from his wounds, but his instincts overrode the exhaustion. His handler, Price, was still tied up. Duke let out a low, guttural growl, his sharp eyes scanning the room. One of the masked men was closing in, gun raised, aiming right at Price's head. Duke didn't hesitate. With a sudden burst of energy, the canine lunged, teeth bared. The attacker barely had time to register the movement before Duke was on him, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's wrist. The gun went off, but the shot missed. The man screamed, struggling against the canine's grip, but Duke held on, snarling, dragging him down to the floor. Connor turned just in time to see the fight. His heart pounded. "Good boy, Duke." The dog didn't let go until Price, still half conscious, managed to kick the gun away. Rick reloaded, breathing heavily. "We gotta move now." Connor ripped the chains off Price's wrists. "Can you stand?" Price gritted his teeth, pushing himself up. "I can shoot." "Good enough." They had to get out before reinforcements arrived. Connor pointed to the far wall, a steel exit door. "That leads to the docks," Rick cursed. "And what, we just steal a boat?" Connor smirked, tossing him a pair of keys. "We borrow one." They bolted toward the exit, Duke limping beside them but refusing to slow down. But just as they reached the door, it burst open. Standing in the doorway was the man from the SUV, the one who had ordered the attack on Price. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable, but his gun was steady, aimed right at Duke. "Give me the dog," he said coldly. Connor stepped forward, blocking Duke with his body. "Not happening." The man sighed. "That dog is worth more than you realize. He knows too much." Connor's grip tightened on his weapon. "So do we." A moment of stillness. Then, the shot rang out. But it wasn't from the man's gun. Price fired first. The bullet hit its mark, dropping the man instantly. Connor exhaled, lowering his rifle. "Damn." Price smirked, even as he stumbled forward. "Told you I could shoot." Rick opened the dock doors. Less talking, more running. The boat engine roared to life as they jumped on board, bullets raining down from the warehouse as more enemies arrived too late. Connor took the wheel, steering them away into the open water. Duke collapsed onto the deck, exhausted but victorious. Price knelt beside him, running a hand through the canine's fur. "You saved me, buddy," he whispered. Duke let out a soft, contented whine. Connor glanced back at the burning chaos behind them. They had won, but they weren't safe yet. The boat cut through the dark waters, its engine growling against the waves. Behind them, the auction house burned, sending thick smoke curling into the night sky. The city lights in the distance seemed almost surreal, a stark contrast to the blood, betrayal, and injustice they had just escaped. Connor's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing. They weren't safe yet. Price sat on the deck, his body slumped against the railing, still weak from his wounds. But his focus wasn't on himself. His hand rested on Duke's head, fingers gently running through the German shepherd's thick fur. The dog lay beside him, his body battered and exhausted. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Price swallowed hard, his voice barely above the hum of the boat's motor. "He shouldn't have had to fight this hard," he murmured. Connor nodded, his jaw clenched. No, he shouldn't have. Because Duke had given everything. And the system that should have protected him had abandoned him. They docked at a secluded marina just outside the city. The plan was simple: disappear. Lay low until they figured out what to do next. But then, Connor made a decision. He pulled out the USB drive they had stolen from the warehouse, the one filled with documents, transaction records, and hidden video files. Proof of what they had done to Duke's handler. Proof of the dirty money, the corruption inside the police force. It was all here. He looked at Price. "How do we make them listen?" Price took a breath, his mind working through the options. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. A few rings. Then, "This is Detective Morales. Who is this?" Price's voice was steady. "It's Price. I have evidence of police corruption. I have proof that Captain Alden ordered my execution, and I have the only surviving witness to it all." There was a pause on the other end. "A witness?" Price looked down at Duke, his hand still resting on the dog's head. "Yeah, a witness." The next few days were a blur. Connor, Price, and Rick stayed hidden as Detective Morales did what good cops were supposed to do. He took the evidence public. The news erupted like wildfire. Breaking news: police captain arrested in high-level corruption scandal. Canine dog at center of investigation. What he uncovered will shock you. Justice for Duke, the dog they tried to silence. Within 48 hours, arrest warrants were issued. Captain Alden was taken into custody. The auction house was raided, exposing a network of traffickers, corrupt officials, and criminals who had been operating in the shadows for years. And Duke became a national hero. A week later, Connor stood outside an animal rehabilitation center. Duke had been brought there for treatment. His body was healing, but his spirit? That would take time. Connor stepped inside, his boots heavy against the clean floors. He found Price sitting on the ground, Duke lying beside him. The dog looked up at Connor, his eyes tired but trusting. Connor knelt down. "Hey, buddy." Duke gave a slow wag of his tail. Price looked up. "They said they want to retire him. Find him a family." He paused. "But I already know where he belongs." Connor's throat tightened. He looked at Duke. "This warrior, this survivor, he's yours," Price said softly. Connor didn't speak for a moment. Instead, he ran a hand down Duke's back, feeling the dog's heartbeat beneath his fingers. Then he smiled. "No," he said quietly. "We belong to each other."
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.